Well, I don't think you need me this week. Because between the challenge from our children and that incredible song, I got chills a little bit when they started that, if not me, then who? Woo, is there one among you? Woo, just sit down. Thank you to our choir. There are more of you. Y'all keep growing up here. I don't know where I'm going to put you next week if you keep hopping like that. You know, the thing about a sermon series about the building blocks of your community is it forces discipline from the preacher. As Ryan said, on any given Sunday, for our leadership to be challenged to give of themselves, to say yes, to lead with prayer. This is it. This is arguably one of the most important stories in all of the Gospels. As Reverend Ryan said, it is one of just a handful of stories that we find in all 4 Gospels. Now, the birth story of Jesus that we celebrate in Christmas is only in 2, and we make a pretty big deal out of that, so we ought to make a pretty big deal out of this little story. And it's especially timely on this day when we celebrate the leadership of our congregation and on a Sunday where we explore how we can be challenged to give in our community, challenged to give of ourselves and to others, and give leadership to the world. We are only 6 chapters in here in Mark's gospel, and Jesus has been teaching and healing, but here in the 6th chapter, Mark the gospel writer shows us how the community takes a turn. They turn into a new corner when just a few verses earlier, Jesus sends the leadership of his community out into the city by themselves, 2 by 2, to encourage people to make a change in their life. He sends them out without him. Preach and heal. And here in this story, we find that they've returned to Jesus and reported in about all the work they've been doing. It's like admin council. Everybody sends in a report, and we sit around and say, ooh, yay, us, look at all the good stuff we're doing. And that's where we find the disciples and Jesus in this story. The problem is that the guys are tired. And the crowds have followed Jesus and his leadership team into this deserted place. It's as if they're desperate for something as they follow this Jesus community. They come to this place that's out in the middle of the nowhere, and the text says this. The text says that Jesus had compassion for them because they are like sheep without a shepherd. You know, if it were me, I'd have probably been like the disciples. Why didn't somebody pack these people a lunch? Why'd they come all the way out here in the middle of nowhere? Not even a power bar in their pocket or something. No grapes for the kids cut up into little squares. No, none of that. Time and again in the Hebrew scriptures, there is this reference to people being compared to a sheep without a shepherd. It's oftentimes when the prophets are trying to stick it to the king. If there happens to be a king, the other place it comes up is when there's no king on the throne of David. But mostly it happens when the prophets want to stick it to the king, to remind him that he's not providing real leadership because the people are suffering as a result of his complacency. Prophets often use this language to remind the powerful that They are using their positions of leadership to exploit their power for themselves with little or no concern for those who are wandering, lost, and helpless. No one to guide them, keep them safe, or out of harm's way. I don't know if anybody ever raised sheep. Anybody ever had sheep? You had sheep? Yeah. Now, sheep, what'd you say?
They give birth in February. They're the dumbest animals.
That's not in my script. I'm telling you, this is what happens when I let people speak. The first thing he said was, sheep are among the dumb animals, which is why they always have to have a shepherd. Always got to have somebody keep track of them and guide them and keep them out of harm's way. And that's what Jesus refers to out of the big old mob that shows up. Now, yes, there was a king on the throne. And if you go back, and I would encourage you to read chapter 6 in its entirety. And if you go back just a couple of verses, Mark does you the great service of telling you where King Herod is. King Herod is off at his great palace throwing himself a big old party. And the people are lost and helpless, and King Herod is throwing a birthday party, to be exact, with dancing girls. It says that in the scripture that there are dancing girls. And of course, what really happens at this party? That old prophet who'd been needling that king, John the Baptist. Everybody knows what happened to John at Herod's birthday party? Yeah, I see you. Off with his head. It ends up on a silver tray. So Jesus was simply living into the prophetic tradition of his faith when he looks out with compassion for these poor folks. And then he takes it one step further by challenging his disciples to step into that role as leader to do the same. The disciples see they're like me. They look around, Jesus, these folks, nobody packed them a sack lunch. Ryan Steitz was not with them because Ryan would have made sure everybody got fed. Nope. Disciples come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, we got to do something about all these people because there's a lot of them. They were already tired, these disciples. They'd been working hard. And there's 5,000 guys. If you read it in the Greek, there's 5,000 guys, and then there's these women over here, and probably littles, which means you got to cut the grapes in half. And the disciples who are tired, they're like, Jesus, you got to get rid of these people. You have to sit down and shut up so that they will go away. They say, what are we going to do with all these people, Jesus? And what does Jesus say? What does Jesus say? You give them something to eat. It's like Jesus says, don't look at me. You do something about it. You have skills. Did you forget that just a few verses earlier, I sent you out by yourself to do work, and you did just fine? Or at least there's no report of them causing major trouble or screwing anything up too terribly bad. You know, and then Jesus has compassion for them, just like he does with the others. I hate it when Jesus is so Jesus-y. You know? These guys are just trying to do their thing and probably blaming people, right? They're probably thinking, oh, well, we should blame all those politicians who are at that big fancy resort, having that big party. We should blame them. This is their fault. And then some of the other of them, they're probably over here thinking, oh, you know all those fancy preacher types run those big fancy churches? It's probably their fault. They probably aren't stocking their food pantry, or they're not helping. Whatever it is they're doing, they're not doing it. And so this one, they're going to blame politicians, and this one, they're going to blame preacher types. And Lord knows there's enough blame to go around, I'm sure. I wouldn't know, but I'm sure. But Jesus, not Jesus. Jesus does not go there. He starts with compassion, and he expects them to do the same. He'd get real angry at old King Herod, but he didn't do that here. That's not going to fix this that's in front of him. And so he says to the disciples, well, give him something to eat. Jesus' style of leadership, into which we are challenged to build the Jesus community around, is one of servanthood and compassion. Even when Jesus stirs up trouble and hangs with all those people that old King Herod didn't invite to his party, he eats with those folks because Jesus is in the people business, and he always puts people above policies. Always. And Jesus is trying to help his leadership understand this, helping them to understand that it takes everybody to step up. He challenges all of them to give, perhaps because he's trying to prepare them to lead when he is gone. You give them something to eat. And as a follower of Jesus, that is the expectation here in week 3, as we navigate the building blocks, the expectations of building our common community together, our Jesus-like community. There is this expectation of giving of yourself, especially when the problem is right smack dab in front of you. Nobody gets a pass. There's a quote that often gets thrown around, and I don't know who it's from. It's like one of those that often gets attributed to Ben Franklin, but isn't Ben Franklin. All I know is it's not Jesus, and I don't think it's Ben Franklin. But it seems kind of Jesus-like to me. It says, true leaders don't create followers. They create more leaders. And that's what Jesus is trying to help his leadership to do. Quit being sheep. Quit being so sheep-like. And so what does he do? He takes this big old massive crowd and he divides them up into small groups. And there's 50 over here and maybe 75 over here. And so there's not this big crowd. When you break it up into smaller portions, maybe you can bite it off and chew it a little easier. That may sound familiar to some of our elders who are stepping into such roles. The gospel doesn't tell us, but I can't help but wonder if Jesus divides them up into this group and then takes each of the disciples and says, okay, now you take this group, and here's their little pot, and you go over there and you serve them. And then he goes over here, and there's 50 or 100 over here. And Donna, you take this group over here. Now you feed them. So that they could do more like Jesus. Jesus was setting that example for them, coming alongside these leaders and showing them how to do it. And he says, now, go show this little group how to do it. Jesus reminds them and reminds us that the life of a Jesus-like community or a Jesus-like world is that the health and the strength and the future of the community are dependent on people stepping up to give. People stepping in to Jesus-like model of leadership. Jesus challenges them to do this over and over again. Y'all, this story is so important to the early church. It's not just in all 4 Gospels. It's in Mark's Gospel twice. If you flip over a couple of pages when you go home and you read chapter 6 later, if you just go flip, or you click that little arrow button twice on your computer if you're reading it online, go to chapter 8. They're going to tell the story again. You give them something to eat. And of course, the thing about it is, after he tells them to do that, the thing about the Jesus-like leadership is he doesn't sit like the man in the high castle with all of these proclamations. He's down in the grass with those folks. He's down in there with them, working alongside them. A hands-on kind of leader. And that is constantly the challenge of building a Jesus-like community. And as we do that to build a Jesus-like community of Jesus-like leaders, we must live into Jesus' challenge to give more of ourselves to this Jesus-like leadership if we really do intend to build a more Jesus-like world. May it be so. You know that little song we sang earlier? Make me a servant? That feels like a Jesus-like song. Make me a servant. What's the next line? Humble and meek. You had the first one. Make me a servant, humble and meek. Lord, let me lift up those who are, and may the prayer of our heart always be, make me a servant. Make me a servant. Make me a servant today. If only more people sang that prayer, that little song, my friends. So my challenge to us is not just to sing it and not just to pray it, but may it be the song and the prayer and the work of our hands as we too try to build a more Jesus-like community for a world desperately in need of a little Jesus-like leadership. May it be so. May it be so for us. Amen.